Welcome, everybody. It's time to start class. We're studying establishing authority this morning. I think we're going to finish this morning, and then we'll move on to some apostasy subjects on Wednesday. If we don't finish this morning, we'll probably have a little bit that bleeds over into Wednesday, and then we'll still start the next lesson. And there are handouts in the foyer for the next lesson as well. Before we begin, I asked Travis Everett if he'd lead us in a word of prayer.
Our righteous and grateful, merciful Father, we are thankful for this day and the opportunity we've had to worship Christ and the sacrifice, to examine our own lives and to compare it to what your desire is for us. And Father, we are thankful now for this time in which we can sit down and open up thy word and look into it and try to gain a better understanding of how we should understand what your desires are for us. We're thankful for Patrick for his preparation and preparing this material. And we pray, Father, that at all times we would open thy word with an open and sincere heart that is willing to change, that is willing to mold our own lives to be in conformity with what you would have us to be. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. So we talked a little bit in the previous lesson about command, example, necessary inference. We talked a bit about why it is that we go about establishing authority by looking at examples, seeing things that have been approved, that were clearly approved by the apostles, and imitating those examples. And one of the things we said was that this is an approach that we take because we judge it to be wise. We judge it to be good, sound practice. And we acknowledged on Wednesday night that is a judgment that we make. This is not what we might consider dogma or doctrine, right? That clearly God commands that we have to do it this way. But rather we say this is what we do because we know that this is approved. We know that this is good in the sight of God. We will talk about, starting on Wednesday night, some of the historical reasons why we choose this approach. That there have been a lot of liberties that people have taken over the years with church structure, how the church is organized, and various practices or works that the church engages itself in. And I'd like to talk a bit this morning about examples and how we go about establishing what we should imitate when it comes to examples. So let's begin by just kind of looking at a few items. Examples by their nature are specific, right? You've got a specific circumstance that things were done in a specific way, and you don't have general examples because the details are very specific to the circumstance. We talked about material details, that is, details that are given in the example that we think are important for us to follow. And then immaterial details, of course, are the things that are given, but really shouldn't be relevant to what we do. And we'll talk about how to make those distinctions in just a minute. Expedients are things that we use as aids in following a practice or a command. Though we may not ever see an expedient in an example, we know that when commands are given, sometimes there's not enough specifics to fully specify how you follow that command. And so we have to supply those details. And, like the command to go, a horse could be an expedient to getting where you need to go to preach the gospel, or a ship, or some other means of transportation. Which details are material and which are not, we're going to talk about that. And this is a really difficult question at the bottom. What is expedient? In other words, something that aids us in getting a command accomplished, and what is just something that we add that is not authorized at all. It's simply something that we make up. And the one thing I do really want to make sure we understand in this lesson is that answering these questions very often requires judgment, right? That these are judgments that we make. And I want to also emphasize that just because it's a judgment doesn't mean it's not important or that there isn't a right answer. It means that we make the judgment based on the best things that we can conclude. And we need to recognize that's our judgment. Somebody else may disagree with that judgment. And ultimately, God is going to be the judge of those things. So let's walk through an example. We started this on Wednesday night. Acts chapter 20. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. And in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third-story window and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him, said, "Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him." Now when he had come up and had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and were not a little comforted. All right, so this is an example of disciples coming together for the purpose of breaking bread, of hearing preaching, and we generally acknowledge this is an assembly for worship. So what details are given, and which ones are material, and which are not? And what I mean material, as in material for our practice, material for us to follow. And so I gave the assignment on Wednesday night, be ready to defend your answers. Okay, so we're going to start with first day of the week. Is that material or immaterial for our practice? We think that's material. And why do we think that's material?
They seem to be emphasis on it and wait 7 days. And we know that on the first day of the week was when, from looking back, was when they did.
Okay. So very specifically in the passage, it said they waited their 7 days. It's almost like they're saying, we're waiting until the first day of the week comes around so that we can worship with the disciples before we leave. That's very, very probable. It's certainly indicative, right? It's suggestive. What else?
In 1 Corinthians, the first day of the week is mentioned also with the giving, and so it seems that the first day of the week was important.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he says, now when you gather together on the first day of the week, Paul was not commanding them to gather on the first day of the week. It was the implication is this is your practice. And since you're already doing it, let's go ahead and make sure that we lay something aside for the collection for the brethren in Judea. So here we've got two congregations, one in Troy, right, Troas, Turkey, and one in Greece, and they both happen to be assembling on the first day of the week. That's pretty indicative that something's going on here that seems widespread. What else do we have? Okay. There's a significance of the first day of the week. The first day of the week was the day on which Jesus rose from the dead. And both in the 1 Corinthian letter and in Acts, it seems that they are partaking of the Lord's Supper at that gathering, when they gather together. One of the purposes for them gathering together is to partake of the Lord's Supper. Okay, so that's also very suggestive. What else? Susan's shaking her head, which means there's not much else in Scripture. But there is the testimony of history. From very early days, it was acknowledged that the first day of the week was the day that Christians gathered together to worship. And that's been known from the beginning. Yeah, go ahead.
John noted the Lord's Day over in Revelation 1:10, which we don't know.
John doesn't identify which day that is, but but the fact that he says there is a day that is the Lord's Day, right? And that would harmonize very well with the idea of the first day of the week.
There was some
Yeah.
day that was special.
Yes. Very good. All right. They came together to break bread. We already kind of talked about that. That's probably a reference to the Lord's Supper, although sometimes the same phrase could be used to talk about coming together for a meal. But it makes sense, especially if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. That was one of the purposes they came together for, right? And so that seems like a material detail that is given there. Okay, Paul spoke to them. Again, preaching. Is that material or not? And if so, why?
Well, it's material because this was a method that was used of instruction
Okay.
for the congregation.
Okay, so we've got this one example where they gathered together and somebody spoke. Is that enough to decide that that's something we should do every time we gather together? Seems like a good idea. But do we have any other passages that kind of talk about this? Yes.
In Hebrews chapter 10, when it talks about not forsaking the assembling of ourselves,
Yes.
there's also an instruction to exhort.
Yes.
So it's not exactly.
Hebrews chapter 10 talks about, provoking one another to love and good works. And the idea there's encouragement that needs to happen when we come together. How about 1 Corinthians chapter 14? There's a heavy emphasis in that chapter about edification, right? The importance, it talks about different spiritual gifts, but it's saying, but let all things be done for edification. The idea is people need to be taught. People need to be encouraged. Go ahead, Brian.
At least these first three things that you mentioned all happened in Acts chapter 2 as well.
There you go.
Pentecost, the first day of the week, they broke bread, they had a message proclaimed, several other things there. But
So you get what I'm trying to get at is when we're looking at details, we want to know, is this a one-time detail or is this a pattern? Are we seeing this in other places? Do we have other New Testament teaching on this? Do we have other New Testament examples of this? And when we start seeing more examples and we start seeing teaching that corroborates the idea, we say, yes, this is something that we should be doing. This is a pattern, right? This isn't just a lone, isolated detail. Message until midnight, is that a pattern? I don't know. Paul probably was pretty long-winded sometimes, but okay. We don't do that, do we? So obviously, we don't think that's necessarily a requirement for this example. This is like the only time I think it's mentioned, right? So, and why else might that detail have been included? Yeah, there's a whole story about this guy falling out a window, Eutychus, and message until midnight is part of that story, right? Upper room is part of that story. Now, is upper room a pattern? Do we see that anywhere else? Where do we see it? When Jesus established Passover. Okay. Okay, so sure. But the upper room certainly is very material to the story of Eutychus, right? that might not have been such a big story, right? He fell out the window and fell 3 feet to the ground. But there are other upper rooms that are mentioned, so maybe we think, well, maybe this is a requirement. But why else might we think upper room is not really an important detail or not really a pattern that we have to follow? They met a lot of places. They met in a school. They met in the courtyard of the temple. There, you don't have an upper room in the courtyard of the temple, right? The riverside, right. So we see a lot of different places that they met. And many of them could not have satisfied the upper room, so we conclude the upper room is not really important. Many lamps, only time I think this is mentioned anywhere. It does not feel like a pattern. Window that could be sat in again. The lamps might even be talking a little bit to Eutychus. It kind of gets a little hot and warm in there, and he gets really sleepy. And then finally sleeping there in the sermon. That is definitely a pattern. It's not an approved pattern. Okay. So you see how I'm trying to do this, right? How do we establish what's a pattern or what's material and what's not? We have to see kind of other places, right? Other places where either there's teaching or there's examples. And we also see that there aren't contrary examples as well, right? Go ahead, John.
You know, Patrick, the one thing it does do is it gives you the opportunity to see that there were things that aided in the worship, and that those things weren't condemned for being used, but at the same time, they don't have to be there, because we have other examples of other things being used. So these are
Yeah.
just expediting things to help with what was going on. They needed the light to breathe. They needed that upper room for the people that lived. And apparently we needed a window so that something could fall out. So.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next topic. We've already talked about the fact that when we're deciding what's material and what's not material, that is a judgment that we're making, right? And we're doing the best with what we have there, but that's not like doctrine. What passages do we have regarding how a church raises and spends its money? I think this was on the handout, if anybody had time to do this over the holiday. What passages do we have? We already talked about one this morning. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must also do. On the first day of the week, let each of you lay something aside, storing as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. All right. So what do we learn from that passage? What are some interesting conclusions we can draw? Yeah.
It can be expeditious to have a weekly collection.
Okay.
Or something like one day.
Okay, so we see a practice here of a weekly collection, right? And that's something we can do. It's an approved example. Some have said this laying by in store, this storing up as he may prosper, was something that they did privately at home. Is that what this passage is saying? Yeah. I think that phrase, that there be no collections when I come, literally means the money's all there, and all I have to do is show up. And there's no going from house to house to collect what everybody's stored up. And that, I think, gives us some authority for a treasury, right? That the church itself has a common treasury that is under the control of the elders. Anything else in this passage? purpose. They were doing this for a purpose, right? There was a very specific reason for this collection, right? They were going to send it to the needy saints in Judea. And Paul even talks about, going to Judea to bear this gift. What else? Claire.
This isn't just a one-off example of one church doing it. He had also given the same command to churches.
That's a good point. Paul had given his instructions to all the churches of Galatia, and he was kind of organizing this. Yeah. What else? So each one determines what they give, right? As they had prospered. It was for the saints. It was specifically for the saints. This is not a general collection for any needy anywhere. Yeah. John.
Well, I've heard it said that this was a specific time given for a specific purpose.
Yep.
And that it wasn't meant to continue on, but rather it was for this drought that was happening in Jerusalem. And I disagree with it because it gives a specific on the first day of the week. If that wouldn't be there, then you wouldn't have a routine being set up.
Yeah.
So there was some routine being set up there through your necessary inference.
Yeah.
This was how the church worked, so that it could continue. Because even in the Old Testament, if you couldn't make it, if you could not make it to the day of Pentecost, if you could not make it to those sacrifices, you were to sell whatever
Yeah.
it was, give it to somebody, and then have them translate and buy what it is on your behalf as a proxy.
Yeah.
And
So.
this is just another process of saying, hey, we need to do some things by proxy, but only for the saints, and it's all given right there on
Yeah.
how we should do this
So.
in a like manner.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. This was for a specific purpose and for a specific collection. They were to do it on the first day of the week every week because, well, some of them got paid daily or weekly, and you need to set it aside so that you don't spend it on a regular basis until it's time for it to go. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do this on a regular basis because we've got ongoing needs, right? This is an approved example of how you can go about doing things. One thing I do want to mention here is that Paul has a great deal of respect for congregational autonomy and responsibility. Paul doesn't say, make sure you got the money, I'll show up and grab the bag and go. He says, whoever you approve by your letters will bear your gift. And I think also Paul didn't really want to take it. He wanted them to be responsible for getting the gift to Jerusalem. They could have said, Paul, you are our representative, and please take the money, and that would have been fine. But Paul wanted them to choose their representative. Jimmy, did you have something, or did I move on? Okay.
The needs, Robert Turner made one in order many years ago. He said, if there's a congregation, he said everything's paid for, they don't have utility bills,
Yep.
anything else, and no need, and then it would not be appropriate for him to have a treasurer. But that doesn't happen very much at all.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on. So we already saw that one. What other passages do we have about raising and using money? And this is, of course, talking about use of the treasury, not use of the money in each of our pockets. Go ahead.
I guess the first time would be with all the conference after Pentecost had things in common, and free will offerings for people selling their
Yes. Yeah. I forgot to mention 2 Corinthians chapter 8 through 10 talks about the manner in which they were to collect the money. It was free will offerings from members of the congregation. And this is still referring back to the assembly for the Judean saints. Yeah, Susan points out that the very first examples we have are in the book of Acts, chapter 2, where you've got people from all over the known world come together in Jerusalem. they've been converted to Christ, they need to stay for teaching, and they didn't plan on staying that long. And so people are selling what they have and sharing with one another. Chapter 2 sounds a lot like a spontaneous sharing. In other words, you're like, you need something, I've got some property, I'm going to sell it, I'm going to help you out. Chapter 4, people are selling bigger pieces of property, they're laying it at the apostles' feet. The apostles are determining how those funds are dispersed. Okay, again, who are we helping? We're helping the saints, right? We're helping brethren. What else? Any other passages come to mind? Philippians chapter 4. Okay, what's going on in Philippians chapter 4? Yes. So Philippians chapter 4 talks about the Philippian brethren sending money to Paul to support his work as an apostle, but as an evangelist, right? So we got money going to the apostle Paul for evangelism from Philippians chapter 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 talks about the fact that those who preach the gospel should live by the gospel, that they are worthy of the wages that they collect in their work. So it is completely appropriate for the collection to be dispersed to those local evangelists or even evangelists so far off for their livelihood. What else? Yeah, go ahead, Leroy. Okay. Widows supported by the church. We see that in Acts chapter 6, but then we also see, as Roy points out, 1 Timothy chapter 3. The example we have in chapter 6 of Acts is the church was supporting widows, right? Those who were in need. And then in 1 Timothy, we see regulations on how that support is to be done, right? What things do we see in 1 Timothy chapter 3? What types of things does Paul say about supporting widows? What was that?
Widow indeed.
Widow indeed. What does that mean?
She had nobody else to support her. She had washed the feet of the saints. That she had been
Okay.
So there were qualifications.
So the first thing is widow indeed means she didn't have any other family, right? There were not children or grandchildren who were capable of taking care of her. The second one is she needs to be, I think, above 60 years old, and she has to be a member in good standing. She's got to be somebody who's known for her good works and for her good conduct. What I think that the Apostle Paul is trying to avoid is people who decide, you know what, I think I need to be a Christian because they take care of their widows. And I'm destitute, and I suddenly have found a new faith. That's what he's trying to avoid. Why is it important that she be a widow indeed?
It says that the church may not be burdened.
Okay. This is important. The primary responsibility for taking care of a widow is her family. In fact, he says, if you don't take care of your family, you're worse than an infidel. That the church may not be burdened. What that tells me is that taking care of the widows is not the primary responsibility of the church. That's not the primary work of the church. Doing benevolence for Christians is a work of the church. It is an authorized work of the church. It's something that we should and can do, but it's not the primary work of the church. The primary work of the church is evangelism and edification. That's what we're trying to do primarily. We do need to do benevolence when people are in need. But 1 Timothy chapter 3 indicates that's somewhat of a burden, and we should not be burdening the church with that if we don't have to. Go ahead. Chapter 5? Yeah, that's great. Okay, good. Thank you. all my notes say chapter 3. Chapter 5. Thank you. All right. Any other things about how we use our money? Yeah. Yeah. So we already talked about supporting evangelists, and then we've got 1 Timothy chapter 5. That really is chapter 5, talking about elders are worthy of financial support. And he uses the same phrase he uses for evangelists. He said, do not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain, and the worker is worthy of his wages. Go ahead.
Kind of an aside, but the Didache, some of you are familiar, laid out, it's a first century handbook, if you will, for one congregation.
Yeah.
If somebody arrived in town, if they were a craftsman of some sort, they were expected to be able to immediately be able to pay for their own
Yeah.
meals. Otherwise, up to 30 days for them to find something that they could do.
Yeah.
They'd be provided for, but after 30 days,
Yeah.
they could move on.
Yeah, the idea there again is don't burden the church. That's not the primary work of the church. We'll take care of people, but we shouldn't be in the business of paying for meals. Go ahead.
Just something to bring up is Acts chapter 5. Ananias said it was a free will offering.
Yeah.
We know that while the money is yours, it's for you to determine. But there is no tithe set up.
Yeah.
And that we have the control over that. And that it is always a free will offering. But one thing we should never do is use the money we give to the church as some sort of an advantage for our reputation.
Yeah. Very good. All right, so what we've got is supporting evangelists, supporting elders, essentially supporting the work of preaching the gospel and of edifying, teaching the membership, and benevolence, right? So we've got benevolence of saints, taking care of needy saints, not just like, making everybody happy, but taking care of legitimate needs that people have. And that's it. So the question might come up, well, don't we have other needs, right? What about orphans' homes? Are those not good works? What about soup kitchens and rehab centers? Are those not good works? What about all sorts of recreational activities that we might invite our friends to so that we might have opportunities to talk to them about spiritual things? What about a fellowship hall where we might share a meal together and invite our neighbors? Could we not use all these programs to bring people to hear the gospel?
There's a difference between what the funds that are gathered for the church to do
Yeah.
and what an individual can do. And all the things you talked about with taking care of orphans, helping people to feel get-togethers to feel closer to their fellow Christians, all those are handled by individual funds
Okay.
because it's not.
But we got this big pot of money. Why couldn't we use the church fund, church treasury for all of those things? Okay.
There's no command exactly.
Brian?
Maybe a better question or a different question.
Yeah.
What about this building here? That doesn't show up in anything that you just showed there. And yet I think we've all agreed that it's worth paying for.
It is.
Why?
And why is it that we use the building? We talked about this already, but we use the building to assemble. It's part of our efforts to edify. It's part of our efforts to get together for worship, as we're expected to do. It is an expedient for those things. It is an expedient for evangelism, right? We have people who are guests who come and hear the gospel when we gather together. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Go back to your
Yeah.
upper room.
Yeah.
An upper room.
Yeah.
acceptable back then, but most of us didn't have air conditioning in our homes.
Yeah.
And it was, get blown away with the
Yeah.
winds we had
Yeah.
last night. So the point is you're gonna spend some type of money, there's gotta be some sort of an arrangement of somewhere to assemble
Yeah.
on a regular basis. And
Yeah.
there's every indication, and in fact, there was a practice and custom from the first century that they were assembling.
Yeah.
They weren't building big cathedrals, but they were actually, in some instances, having some buildings set aside specifically for them.
When I was in Africa about this time last year, there were people worshiping outside, or just outside. I think y'all had class outside under the tree. Yeah. The question is, are these things merely expedients, or are we adding different works, right? The soup kitchens and rehab centers for anybody, not just Christians, we don't have an example for that. And we do have, by the way, this is an interesting thing. If we decided it's a good work for us to feed the poor and to support the poor, and we're just going to bring in anybody who's needy, and we're going to take care of them, we've got this interesting situation where we have regulations about what widows we can support, but we're suddenly willing to support anybody from the community just because. That doesn't make sense, does it? Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
To answer your question, how do we justify using one and not the other?
Yes.
This list and not this list?
Yes.
I think in our conversations with people that disagree with us,
Yes.
the place we should start is where we ended our last class.
Yes.
Because that's what we've decided would be the wise decision. We've used sound judgment, and we have to make some judgment calls.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you start going down the path of we can have this building to edify saints, but the building in the parking lot to edify saints over there is unscriptural, you're all going to hell for having the second building.
Yes.
That's going to be a real hard sell for a lot of people when what they're looking at is what they believe to be a judgment call. And I believe it is a judgment call. We're using sound judgment and what we believe to be the best decision and the best use of our money.
Yeah. I've heard it. I heard a really good illustration this summer. The American Cancer Association collects money for cancer research, for education, for support of cancer victims, and they collect a lot of money, right? And what if I know somebody who's got ALS? And I go to the cancer center and say, you guys have a big pot of money. Could I use some of that for ALS research? What are they going to tell me?
No.
And what reason are they going to tell me for saying no? Are they just going to be heartless, say no? Yeah, in fact, they might even say, you know what, that sounds like a really worthy cause. Why don't you go ask the ALS organization for that? That's not our mission. Our mission is cancer. Our mission is cancer research and support of cancer patients. So similarly, when somebody says, the church seems to have a big pot of money, this is a good work, why don't we spend it on that? And I would answer, that's not our mission. Right? Even benevolence for Christians is not primarily our mission. Eric.
It's also helpful to think about the autonomy of this word separate. When people think religion, why don't churches do this?
Yes.
What they're typically imagining is the mega church where
Yes.
the preacher's a millionaire.
Yes.
And so I don't know about churches, I know about our church. And so we'll see what money comes in and what money goes out.
Yeah.
And then you tell me which of the preachers in the Philippines you're going to tell me we're cutting off his support. Like, you take the red pen and start crossing off names, and you tell me which one of these villages in Africa doesn't get seed money, and then we'll take that money that you cut from somewhere else, and we'll go play basketball with it, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? So making it very unique to our group, I think,
Yeah.
is very important, so that people see, look, we're not just sitting on a pile of money.
Yes.
That is not happening at Cedar Park.
Yeah.
At Cedar Park, we are bringing in a lot of money, and we are spending a lot of money
Yeah.
on good things.
I think that's an excellent point. For every dollar that you spend on something, it's a dollar you're not spending on something else, right? And we have to be good stewards of the money that we collect and the money in our own pockets, by the way, whether we're giving it up or not. The other part is sometimes when we think, okay, it's the church's responsibility to take care of the poor. And I'd say, yes, it is, but that doesn't mean the treasury. That means the church. That means you and me. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Well, that was one of the points I was going to make. We still have that responsibility to do it as individuals as we as we find somebody. Secondly, though, I want to just flip this around. If you're looking for a means of agreement, nobody would argue against the list that you had up there. They wouldn't have any problem
Yeah.
doing those.
Yeah.
Okay. You go beyond, just like instruments, music, other, you go beyond, and now you split congregations because some may think that looks okay to do more.
Yeah.
But you don't have any real basis to say that it's appropriate. So I think it's a good test for us if we want to maintain unity as well.
Okay. So what can we use money for? Evangelism, edification, benevolence. Again, these are broad categories, and there are a lot of expedients involved, right? And there are ways that we can look at various things we could do and say, yes, this is expedient for one of these three categories. John.
I like what Eric really had to say. That didn't make sense until the last few sentences to me, but the idea is don't forget there is a command. Pure and undefiled religion is this.
Yeah.
What? Visit the widows and orphans in their trouble.
Yeah.
And a lot of people want to see that as a church command instead of an individual command. But the reasoning on how you can divide this is the pure fact that we have these stipulations made for where we can use all this money.
Mm-hmm.
But if you open it up to everybody else, then it doesn't make any logical sense. There's a reason why everything is stipulated. But if you go back to the Ananias story, while it was yours, you could do with it however you wish. And a lot of people did a lot of charitable good works out of their own pockets without giving it to a church. And why we think we have to give it to a community pile instead of taking care of people on our own.
Yeah.
In our own neighborhood around us, it just takes away. People don't want to be responsible. They just want to say, well, I'll give out money and then I'm good. I'm a good person. But rather, by doing it on a daily basis by those people around you, that is pure religion. By giving and loving people, not being forced to do it, rather doing it by free will of your own will.
Okay. Okay, so I've got a kind of mental exercise here, and I don't know how long this is going to take, and we're probably out of time. But there are two questions I'm asking here. May the church do these things? And the second one is, should the church do these things? Those are two different questions. The first question, may the church do this, is it authorized? Second question is, should the church do this? As in, like, is this a good idea? Different questions. All right. Number one, own property, own a building. I think we've already established the church may do this. It is expedient for our gathering together. And in many cases, the answer is I think the church should do this, but I'm not convinced that's always true. In fact, maybe in many cases, it's really not a good idea. But we'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.